Okay, next on the agenda is the Conservancy. And Beth, you're in charge.
Morning.
Morning.
That's Darrow,
Morning.
Chief Scientist at Bald Head Island Conservancy. Met a lot of you guys last year. Contact information is right here. We have a lot of different projects that we conduct as part of our environmental services contract. I'm just going to touch on them today, but I'm always happy to answer questions, have conversations. I love talking about our island and our habitat. So yeah, feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk more. So as I said, there are a lot of projects, and I hope I don't cause whiplash by going through them pretty quickly today, but they range from the forest to the dunes to the marsh and creek to the wildlife of the island. We try to take care of the things that maybe an environmental consultant would if they were off island. I think it's a little more economical for the village to have our staff do this because we're here locally. And then we also try to provide contact and collaborations with outside researchers in areas that we may not be complete experts in. My background is marine science, not deer biology, but we try to provide those contacts and expertise through collaborations as well. So I'll go through these sort of in different types of habitats, give some updates, and talk about what we might request for next year. We'll start with the forest. So this year we haven't really done too much in the forest. We've been mostly in the maintenance phase, but I just wanted to re-emphasize the importance of the maritime forest. This is a globally imperiled habitat type. So when you're considering, development plans and different stressors on the forest in the future, it's important to remember that we have a really, really unique gem of an ecosystem here on the island that we should protect. And I'm not just talking about the forest proper, meaning like the Bald Head Woods Coastal Reserve, but think about all the other forested habitats that we have on the island, residential areas, tree protection, those little municipal, maybe annoying things that you might have to deal with. But in the end, the goal is to protect this really important habitat type. So part of the reason why we're looking at the vegetation in the forest is because we have some policies about our deer population that came from a study in 2011 from Taggart and Long, where they looked at impacts on the maritime forest vegetation by deer. So deer are not native to this island as far as we know. We think they came across in the 80s or the 90s, and they can eat a lot of plants. So what are the impacts of those deer on the forest, different types of plants, diversity? And in 2011, Taggart and Long did not find an effect. And the way that they did that is by constructing these fenced areas, exclosures, where deer could not get in, and they compared those to open areas. And they said, okay, if there's no difference, then we don't think that the deer are having an effect on those plants. So the hard thing is through time, maintaining these things, especially when you have hurricanes and other hurricanes. And so in 2018, 2019, these are looking pretty rough. They weren't really excluding deer anymore. So we fixed all of them. They're all standing up now. And what we're doing now is going out monthly and just making sure that they stay upright. And we want to do that so that we can look at long-term changes. So not just impacts of deer, but also how do those interactions work together or against other stressors on the forest, such as development, just storms, disease, other things that might happen, maybe due to climate over the long term. So right now we're just evaluating maybe in 5 years. And right now we're just maintaining those exposures.
Beth, question, are those enclosures only in the state preserve?
Correct.
Not on association common area elsewhere?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So this map here shows where the different exposures are. In protecting the forest, it's also important to look at the freshwater resources that provide that freshwater for the vegetation. We pump water to use for our population, and those production wells are in the middle of the forest. So there's an agreement with Bald Head Woods Coastal Reserve to look at the amount of water that's still in the aquifer, And then also to check on that vegetation every so often to make sure that there are no long-term changes due to water pumping. So we've been doing this monthly. We go out, we check all the wells. You can see it's kind of divided by different areas of the island. But the most concerning area that we care the most about are these swales. And I'll show a picture in a minute, but swales are really interesting. If you haven't seen them, they're the indentations in the dune that create ephemeral ponds. And this is the only natural source of fresh water on the island. They're not man-made, they're just from a divot, basically. And sometimes they're wet, sometimes they're dry, but they could have really important rare plant species there. So we want to be careful of protecting those swales.
And Beth, just for council's knowledge, that's budgeted in our utilities budget. Part of it's in utilities budget because it's dealing with the well production, well field corridor. And the other part is in administration with working with Applied Resource Management and Jim Cornett, who's sort of our hydrogeologist consultant. And this was put in place at the time previous council worked with the developer to change that 50-foot easement that ran all the way through the Maritime Fort to the corridor as it exists today that runs runs adjacent behind public or contractor services and public works. And I can send you all a map so you can see it visually. But anyway, it was agreed between the developer, the village, and the state. And as part of that, the state did ask us to monitor the effects of putting in the wells in there. So they could have some idea of the effects of the well field. Also, we went ahead and permitted, or on that site plan, it includes the ability to increase the number of wells within that corridor, just to ensure we have enough potable or enough well water to supplement with county water for drinking.
So here are the swales, in case you're wondering what they look like. These are a couple of different ones, but you can see how much they change through time. This really is precipitation based, and they don't fill up with water like this just from one rainstorm. This is, I believe, December 2018. So this was after Florence and a very rainy year, 2018. And then for a while, this is commonly what it looks like in the summertime, kind of grassy. So it's moist enough to provide for plant growth, but it's not full of water where you need to use waders to access it. And then here on the right, this is just last month. This is kind of winter time when the grass dies back, but it's accessible. And the important part here is that as part of this management plan, the village was supposed to fund vegetation studies done every few years. But for a long time, it looked like this on the left. So it makes it really hard to look for vegetation when it's full of water.
Could you
yeah.
orient me just where physically are these photographs?
These are, let's see, I can go back. I don't know if this is going to help. No.
It's you can access it from Cedar Court or Grove Court.
Indian Blanket
is
one. You can go back behind Public Works.
Okay.
There are a couple back there. There's basically 5 different swales that we look at, and you have to they're all in the same area in that valley.
I got there now.
But yeah, I'll take you sometime. There's one that's pretty easy to access. It's pretty cool. So part of what we're doing we had a meeting about a month ago with Bald Head Woods, Coastal Reserve, Jim Cornett, Chris is there. And one of the things we're looking at is, do we need to keep monthly monitoring forever and ever? Because it's a lot of work for, what's happening with the data right now. And so one of the things that I started pulling together is looking at precipitation and then its effects on the water in the swales. So basically when we have very high, this is like a 3-month average precipitation in 2018, we have a lower depth to water in the swales. The lower depth to water is basically those wells are fuller because we're reaching it from the top, if that makes sense. So trying to look at, is there a point at which we can predict if we have a really dry period, are we gonna run out of water in the forest? Probably not, but that's something that's gonna be discussed with the group probably after this vegetation sampling is done. And the vegetation sampling right now is scheduled for September. We're getting some botanists from, unfortunately, all the botanists are retiring. So there's a botanist from UNC and one from NC State that are gonna come back and do this work for us. For the village.
Are you speaking of not enough water from an environmental point of view?
Yes.
Or are you talking about, and also, or not enough water down in our aquifers to feed the island?
I don't think that's likely to happen for a very long time. There's a lot of water in the aquifer. But one of the things that we've been looking at through time, and I'll transition into the wells throughout the island because we do this work as well. This is not Bald Head Woods specifically, but this is, you know, you may see these wells all over different roads and such. We want to look at through time as we've been pumping, as the village has been pumping water to use for production. Do we see any trends through time? So that would be something we would look for. If we start seeing less and less and less water, then that might be something that we would want to discuss. But you can see here, these are annual averages from 2009 through 2022. And these are little box plots, and you don't see any trends through time. There's more variability within a year than there is from year to year. So in 2022, it was a little bit of a drier year. So maybe that box is a little lower than other years, but there is no long-term trend. So far, I think so good in terms of our water source here on the island.
And you are also, on behalf of the village in this program that's been going on, measuring for saltwater intrusion.
Yes. Yep, and I have a slide here.
Okay, sorry.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so we also quarterly, we pump the wells and we look at the water quality in the wells. So this graph is showing conductivity, which is kind of like saltiness, or the amount of ions in the water. And then these different bars are divided by the different types of sites. And then we're looking through time. So the different types of sites, we have sites that are on Cape Fear Trail on the west side of the island. Those are the orange bars. We have some at the Conservancy, which kind of represent the east side of the island, that's the red. We have some in the dunes. So those are kind of along South Beach and the dunes. That's hard to see the colors here. Then golf course and then Middle Island. And you can see that consistently through the years, the Middle Island wells have the highest conductivity, salinity. This is because the little freshwater lens on Middle Island is very shallow, and it's very influenced by the marshes and the creeks on both sides. And then we have Cape Fear Trail and the dunes. They are on the perimeter of the island, so they are getting some saltwater intrusion into those wells. But it's been consistent through time. So we haven't seen like increasing conductivity in those wells through time. We haven't seen conductivity or saltwater in our interior wells. So I think we're still good. We do have salinity on the exterior of the island, but it's not encroaching and it's not increasing through time. Does that make sense?
Is that just by virtue of its location?
Yeah.
Relative to the ocean?
Yeah, so the freshwater, groundwater is a lens. So if you picture, it's kind of higher in the middle and smaller on the outsides. So you're getting some of that contact with the salt water on the edges of the island as opposed to the middle. Do you have a question over here?
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, that's inevitable, pretty
Right,
much, right?
yeah.
So Beth, I recall when we were they're studying, doing the task force work after Florence, there was the concern about the freshwater lens and its change over time, the impact of the dredging and the widening of the channel and so forth. And I recall that the southwest part of the island, Cape Fear Trail area, there seemed to be more and more salt intrusion over time. And the concern the trend was heading that way, but then it looks like in 2020 and 2021, it's bumping back up a little bit.
It kind of varies through time.
Okay, so
And
that really not telling us anything other than it's just gonna keep doing it. Instead of a long.
if you look at
Degradation.
individual wells, sometimes you can get a long-term trend, but it's very, very slight.
Okay.
And I don't think we're seeing that for conductivity. I think we see that a little bit for the depth to water, but I think that just has to do with different rainy periods and dry periods.
Okay.
That being said, I do think it would be a good idea to let, you know, if you end up having consultants work on things like the channel deepening, we're happy to provide data. We have long-term data for aquifers, for creek water quality. Happy to use that if it could be of use for any of those environmental impact statements.
Good idea.
Okay, so we're still kind of in the woods here, moving on to some cuter things like deer. We have a long-term project where we've looked at population size. We have two different methods that we use for that. One is summer spotlight surveys, and the other is camera surveys that we do in the fall. And they look at two different kind of aspects of the deer population, but they're used together to provide these population numbers that we see on the right. So this is the long-term population size from 1999 to present. And you can see how in the early 2000s, we had populations that were sometimes above 300. And that's when people were very concerned about overpopulation of the deer on the island and needing some way to manage them. We don't have hunting on the island, so they tend to get out of control. We don't have natural predators, or at least we didn't at that time. So where we have these little valleys is where culls were conducted by the village. And then we moved into a period where we got a permit to do immunocontraception work from 2014 to 2020, which is a non-lethal management method. So we had a research permit through the state to conduct a research project, which looking at the effectiveness of this Gonacon drug, which is an injection that has to be given to the deer. So we have to actually physically capture the deer in order to do that. And then every deer that's been captured gets the ear tags. So if you're wondering like why they have these cattle ear tags, that means that that deer has been captured at some point. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're still infertile, because this stuff does wear off after a while. And we're starting to see more and more moms with fawns that probably, they haven't had a dose of Gonacon since maybe 2020 or 2019. So we're at 150 deer right now. That's below our target population size of 200. But the fawn population has increased 3 times since last year. We're at 17 fawns. It doesn't seem like a lot of fawns, but they do tend to kind of accelerate and multiply. So our advice, and we talked with the village with Chris about this, is to try to pursue an operational permit for using immunocontraception in the future as needed. So you wouldn't need to have another 5-year study, which if they tell us that we need to do one, we can certainly come up with lots of cool research ideas. But I think it would be cleaner for the village to just be able to make a decision on a year or every other year basis to conduct these operations again. This is kind of the process of what this looks like based on the seasonality of the deer reproductive cycle, plus when we conduct the different studies on their population size. And in the past, we were limited in doing the immunocontraception operations after the hunting season ended in Brunswick County. I'm also asking the Wildlife Resources Commission if we still need to do that, because there were concerns that if we were to give a sedative drug to a buck and then it swam across to the mainland and then somebody hunted it and then they ate it, and then, it's a lot of steps that would need to happen for someone to really be maybe negatively impacted by this. I think the proportion of possibilities of that happening are pretty low. So ideally, we would have a permit in place that the village could do this every year. So if we see that number pop over 200, we can say, okay, next year we're going to do this. And ideally, we could do it in the reproductive season in the rut, fall, or maybe early winter, because the drug would be more effective for the females. Yeah.
Beth, can you remind me on the deer that are tagged, we monitor how many doses they were given?
Yes.
Okay, because 2 doses, we know the effective rate is much higher.
Correct. Yeah. So the effectiveness overall was 86%. But some of those deer, we weren't able to capture. It's kind of hard to find an individual deer on this island and get them. So sometimes maybe they had a year between their 2 doses, or maybe sometimes they didn't get their 2nd dose. But once you look at the deer that got both of their doses in successive years, that rate is like 95% effectiveness.
And they've got the 2 tags, right?
Everybody who's been captured has 2 tags.
Oh, they have to.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we have records on who
You have
has,
records of-
like when they got their drugs, everything.
Because each one's numbered like 100.
Yeah,
Was
still around.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
There was some concern at one time about 100, but
Yeah, she moved around. I think she was having a baby and anyway. They're like our workers now.
Beth, can you talk briefly about what the difference will be from a budgeting standpoint to do a maintenance program versus a full?
So I think on a year-to-year basis, so when council would decide to go ahead and pursue, contraception, it would cost a certain amount. I think that amount that it would cost would probably be the similar, if not a little higher, just because costs of everything have gone up.
Okay.
The tricky part before was that technically we were supposed to do it every year because we had this research permit to do it every year, and we said we would do it every year. But every year the village had to appropriate the funds and make a decision whether to do it every year. And I think this just would make it cleaner where y'all can decide, yes, we're doing it this year, or maybe we'll do it for 2 years just to make sure, try to get those their 2nd dose. And then maybe we'll take a little break, and then maybe we'll do it for another 2 years. That'll be your decision and not necessarily coming from the state every time saying you have to do it for 5 years. That helps. We'll see what they say. The problem is there's no policy, there's no state policy for this type of operation. So doing it as a research permit made it a lot easier for them to agree to it, because they said, okay, we can try something out. But right now there's no way to have an operational permit for deer management in this way at all.
we have files, Scott, that we can get back and look at what that cost in the annual budget.
And I did a projection last year, so I can provide that too, if that's a question. So this year, we're not really asking for any funds for this. We're just, we have, I think, a little bit of funds in this year's budget to produce the proposal, so. Okay, so moving on to the creek, we conduct water quality sampling. We collect a number of data on a number of different parameters. We have 3 kind of different programs that we do. One is weekly sampling, where we go to 4 different sites within, well, 3 sites within Bald Head Creek and 1 site at Cape Creek, which is kind of a control site. And then we collect, basically we're just taking a dip sample and measuring that for nutrients, fecal coliform, and we're also taking physical characteristics with our instrument. And then we do quarterly sampling at 2 sites, one at the mouth and one at the head, where we look for any changes over a day-to-day, a diurnal period. So we take samples every 3 hours for 24 hours. And then thirdly, the past 2 years, we've done a shoreline survey, which is looking for known and potential pollution sources. And we try to do this in a dry period and then also after a storm to see what kind of contaminants might be coming from off the land, stormwater and such. So I won't provide all the graphs. I'll put them in a report. We'll just look at fecal coliform bacteria, because that's usually the thing that people care most about. So this is, this is bacteria coming from fecal sources. If it's really, really high concentrations, it's usually from a wastewater source. You could get some coming from wildlife, but not usually at very high concentrations. And this is looking through time. These are our 3 different sites in the creek, and then our Cape Creek site. And basically what we're seeing is still relatively low concentrations in 2022. Nothing super concerning except for right after Hurricane Ian, when, if anyone was on the island, they probably remember a lot of storm surge. It was over the road, it was backing up, and we'll look at that in a little more detail in a minute. So far, so good for the most part. There are a couple problem areas that we'll look at in a second. And then really excited to talk about our new project. This is funded by the U.S. Coastal Research Program. And I don't know if that's a federal, I mean, that's a federal program, so something to think about in projects in the future. But we have a new water quality station at the mouth of the creek. And we have this instrument that's deployed measuring all these things all the time, basically every 15 minutes. And that data is going to be combined with those grab water samples from fecal coliform bacteria to try to predict bacterial concentrations in real time. This is not expertise that I have, but this is our collaborator, Natalie Nelson from NC State. So that's a pretty cool application of data coming from Bald Head Creek. They chose us for this project because we have a long-term data set of fecal coliform bacteria and all the other parameters that they might even be able to do hindcasting and say, hey, yeah, like we can look at this data and see responses in fecal coliform bacteria. And we got letters of recommendation from the FDA for this project, so they're pretty excited about it. And this data will be able to be used for a lot of different things as well. Hopefully, eventually we'll have it on our website. So even if you're going fishing, you'll know what the dissolved oxygen is or the salinity, and you can just look it up on your phone. That'd be cool. Maybe one day. So I mentioned Hurricane Ian. This is where we did some spatial sampling of the creeks. It was actually the Monday after the hurricane passed, so it had been a few days. But even at that point, we had some problem areas of really high fecal coliform concentrations in the stormwater, some of the stormwater culverts. And it did come out into the creek as well. The round dots are a creek. Here at Timber Creek, we had concentrations that were significantly above regulatory levels for recreational water, shellfish growing waters. And we know that the Timber Creek pump station went down because of that floodwater inundation at that time. So it wasn't a big surprise, but this is always kind of a problem area. Like when we do see high bacterial concentrations, it tends to be around Timber Creek. And I can't always, I let the village know if we see something high in our numbers. It's not very often anymore, but just something to think about, when you're planning for infrastructure in the future, is planning for sea level rise, planning for storms, that, those pump stations and everything need to be protected. And I think it's a good idea to do this, at least once or twice a year. Any questions about creek before I move on? All right, so beach vitex, if you don't recognize it, this is the culprit. If you have it in your yard, please don't encourage it to grow. It tends to take over the place. You can see these long runners. So we've been fighting a battle against beach vitex for, 15 years.
07. The council did approve, just so you know, council approved an ordinance at that time that banned.
Yeah, do not plant beach vitex. It does have really beautiful flowers, but it's problematic here because it outcompetes the native plants and it can potentially interfere with sea turtle nesting habitat as well. So we have been fighting this with herbicides for a number of years. We've been experimenting with different methods. I think we've found probably the best method and time of year to do this, but it's just long work because you have to basically cut gashes in each individual plant and paint it with herbicide. So it takes a long time. We've also been using UAV or drone technology to identify the locations of beach vitex as opposed to tromping all through all the dunes, which is what we used to do. And that's been a lot more efficient. So here's an example of what we do with the drone. Basically, you can see it, it's so bright green. If we do this during the middle of the growing season in the summer, the vitex really pop out at you in GIS imagery. So then we circle them and we measure the area. I did that. Questions while we're waiting? Beach vitex? Smells really good too. I think it would make a great essential oil. We could just like grind it all up.
Well, coincidentally, folks at Topsail Beach
Mhm.
reached out to me and I told them you guys did this work on behalf of the village and I'm not sure if anyone had reached out to y'all yet, but I said they,
Recently?
yeah, I had within the last month or so. but-
Yeah, we were, last year we were talking with, there were a bunch of different rangers from different parks and Audubon and different people that are trying to, they're putting together a big database of where Vitex is throughout the state. And unfortunately, nobody is really, I think we might be some of the few people that actually invest money in eradicating beach Vitex. Nobody else is paid to do this work. So it's just, somebody is out there serving for birds and she's like, I'll try to kill some stuff while I'm out here. And
What's the origin of, just while we're waiting?
yeah,
What's the origin of the Vitex?
it's from Australasia. It's native to that area, but people planted it. Well, there are a couple of things. Some people plant it because it's a beautiful plant and you can tell in some areas on the island, you can tell that somebody intentionally put it there. And then also, unfortunately, it was recommended as an anti-erosion plant. So there were some intentional plantings throughout. I know South Carolina, I'm not sure about here by the Corps, or at least it was recommended by the Corps.
And what's wrong with it? What's it do?
It outcompetes the sea oats. So sea oats are a native dune building plant and it goes across the surface instead of going deep into the soil. So it doesn't really have its advertised effect of helping.
Has no structural integrity to hold the dune intact like CO.
So yeah, we want the,
So whenever we do a CO plant starts out like a little sprig. And then you plant it and as it grows, the dune grows. And if you've seen erosion of a dune with sea oats, you see the root system. That root system started out that tall. So it's pretty amazing.
The Vitex grows laterally and puts out these runners, but it doesn't really hold the sand.
For what it's worth, Beth, we've learned, my wife and I have been fighting beach Vitex on our property. We cut it back, we used herbicide, but the thing that worked best is you dig the root ball up.
Yeah.
And just, once you start pulling that. You
Chasing it around the yard.
Yeah, but then once that's done, it's done. For several years, we didn't have any problem, so
Yeah.
I started.
Yeah, it's very understudied. So I was told a lot of kind of stories about Vitex, like be careful if you break it because they're all going to grow back. And okay, so they do grow back, but they're not going to grow back more than you don't need to worry about each of those fragments all turning into its own plant or something. So at first I was really advised not to cut it, not to pull it. But I think it's okay to cut it and pull it as long as you're not destroying the whole dune, which in some of these spots, there's so much of it that you can't. And one of the things that we've talked about is if we were to start pulling it all, where would we put it? Where would we dispose of it on the island? Because it should be probably burned at that point to get rid of it. So right now we're still cutting and adding our herbicide, but I think it would be smart to pull it or cut it at the base and then put herbicide.
Yeah.
But then we have all this stuff that we don't know what to do with.
Yeah, now that you say that, I called JC's crowd to come pick up my yard waste and probably wherever it went from there. Chop it into mulch and spread around the island. I didn't.
There used to be a separate,
Public confession.
there used to be a separate site for Vitex, right? Maybe
Yeah, I mean, in
maybe
the
established.
heyday and the throes of it when we first started,
Yeah,
we made it intentional to keep it separate
Mhm.
in a debris pile. Probably almost here where we sit today.
Yeah.
That's when we contracted to have it ripped out.
talk to JP about that. All right, so how are we doing? We treated everything last year. We found that fall treatment works the best. And we do have, if you look at the sites on the right, these are the ones that are in treatment. And we do have fewer sites in treatment or live plants sites since we started really keeping track of these in 2020. And then a number of them, they're being used for this experiment. So we weren't treating them for a while, but not found and dead, that's a good thing. They're not very many compared to how many there's still out there, but we kind of feel like we're holding the line at least. And it's just, I think, something that we're just gonna have to keep doing if we want to keep Vitex under control. I don't think we need to do the aerial surveys every year. I think we could do those probably every 2 years. That's pretty time consuming. And as long as we're treating, hopefully we don't have too much popping up, you know, in that inner. We know where they are now pretty well. We've identified them. All right, so more green things. Talk about alligators. We do predator surveys in the summertime. The alligator surveys are spotlight surveys as well. We've got to look at them in all the golf course lagoons and the ibis sanctuary out on Middle Island and the villas. And if we take out 2020, we had a reduced route that year, but you can see that we have, looks like a higher population of alligators in the past couple of years compared to like the 2017, 2019 period. But most of these are juveniles, they're little babies. There's one mom, I think it's hole 16, the lagoon there, that has consistently had a lot of babies the past few years. So a lot of these unfortunately don't make it up to adult size. So even though we see higher numbers, they're not higher numbers of like 12-foot alligators. They're little babies that probably are getting eaten by something by the time they get to be big boys. We're also collaborating with Dr. Scott Belcher. We've been working with him since 2019. He's an ecotoxicologist from NC State that looks at contaminants in wildlife blood. And then this year we also satellite tagged 5 alligators to see where these alligators go. We're wondering if they go out into the river, if they might go other places besides Bald Head Island, and if that's possibly where they could be picking up contaminants, or if they're picking up contaminants here on the island. So here's.
When you say satellite tag, what is that?
So it's like a GPS that we put on the alligator's head.
Okay.
And it's talking to the satellite. So just a little bit of data. This is from Dr. Belcher's lab. This was released this past year. This is looking at PFAS and Gen X in alligator blood. These are alligators are all captured in 2019, including on Bald Head Island. And the top plot is showing the total PFAS. And I pulled out the Bald Head Island from the Cape Fear River watershed in general, but they considered it as part of the Cape Fear in their paper. And what they found is higher concentrations of PFAS in Cape Fear compared to a control site at Lake Waccamaw. And they also found higher incidences of unhealed lesions and other immune disruptive functions. So they think that these PFAS are causing issues for the alligators' immune systems. When you pull out the Gen X, that was kind of scary to me because the Bald Head Island alligators had the highest concentrations of Gen X of any other alligators, including the other Cape Fear alligators. And we don't know the source of that in their blood. But that led us to the question of, are these alligators going out into the river, getting exposed there, or are they getting exposed here on the island? So that's why we put little trackers on their heads. It also is helpful for public safety to know where these alligators go, what their habits are. And this is not information that we share publicly, but I have one little tidbit here. We think this is Fluffy. Many alligators have been called Fluffy. We initially called him Alfred, but based on his habits, this is the club. And here's, the driving range. And this is where, people talk about Fluffy hanging out on the driving range. So this is where he hangs out. And it's a pretty small, narrow area, I think. He doesn't really stray from the golf course. He doesn't stray from that part of the golf course. I know which tree he likes to hang out under. And I think that's really interesting that he's not swimming all over the Cape Fear River. He's not going to Oak Island. He's getting whatever he's eating in these 3 holes of the golf course, pretty much. So stay tuned, but I think that's pretty interesting. Coyotes. Have you noticed fewer coyotes this year? Yes, so have we.
I still see a lot of them.
They're around, but we think, well, there are less on our surveys. So summer spotlight surveys, we do these while we're looking for deer. If we see a coyote, we write it down. And in 2022, we didn't see any, like 0 during our surveys. So that was really surprising because they had been on the increase for the past 5 years. And we also had no sea turtle nest depredation. Yes, that was very exciting, which then led to the best year on record for sea turtle hatchlings making it into the ocean. So with no depredation and no hurricanes, that meant that our sea turtles were really, really productive this year. So that's a good thing. But we're kind of curious why that is. We are doing a population study right now where we're looking at their scat to see how related and how many individuals there are on the island. But while that's going on, I got in touch with Fort Fisher because I know that they do trap coyotes. And look at how many they trapped in 2021 compared to previous years. So they trapped 12 individuals in winter 2021, which I have a suspicion led to, I have a feeling these populations are very connected and we're just not getting that immigration of coyotes from Fort Fisher this year. So I think, I mean, this doesn't cost a lot of money. We're just doing it while we do deer surveys, but I think it's pretty cool to know what's going on with the coyotes.
Anecdotally, I've seen hardly any scat
Yeah,
on the roads,
I know. And of course, this is the year that we're trying to collect it.
right? Where it's last year, year before, it was all over the place.
Yeah, I know. I'm looking for it. Let me know if you see it.
Okay.
I'll go get it.
All right.
We do shorebird conservation work. We protect beach nesting birds, put up postings. You may see them out at Access 11 down by Terminal Groins in summertime and at Access 1. So we put up signs like this with ropes, try to keep people out of those areas because these eggs are very camouflaged and you may not see it until you've already stepped on it or until your dog has stepped on it. So please stay out of those areas, keep your dogs out of those areas. We did have a successful Wilson's plover nest last year and 3 chicks we're pretty sure made it out into the great beyond. We don't know after that, but they're pretty cute little cotton balls on toothpicks. So hopefully we get another nest this year, maybe more than one. We also do bi-weekly bird surveys just to know what birds are on the island. I don't have any data from that, but that's been a pretty cool addition to especially our education programs.
The Wilson's plovers, they didn't happen to be ever by the terminal growing billet, were they?
Yep, Access 11.
Okay.
Yep.
Nice.
These are just a couple interim projects. These aren't funded by the village, but just to let you know that we did an oyster reef restoration project over the past couple of years, and one of our interns looked at the success of that project, and he was finding equal numbers of live oysters on the new restored oyster reefs as wild oyster reefs. So that was pretty cool. And then another one of our interns looked at the terrapin excluder devices that the village has been helping fund to provide. So these are required to be on all crab pots in the Bald Head Island natural area. And we have gotten a little pushback from the public saying, when you put this little thing on our crab pot, there's no way that legal size crabs can get in there. So her study was looking at that, and she found throughout the month of October, she caught 80 crabs and 95% of them were legal size or larger. So that was pretty cool. We still have a bunch of TEDs. So if you have a crab pot and doesn't have one yet, we're happy to install them for you. And we're going to do a little marketing campaign this spring for those to get them installed. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about this project. I don't know whether this will be part of the village contract or not, but I thought that maybe this is something that council should be aware of or maybe speak to. We have an idea for a living shoreline project. So it's like a restored oyster reef, but it's using instead of the bagged oyster shells that you may be familiar with, it's using this new substrate called oyster catcher, which is a biodegradable substrate, and it's been really successful a bunch of different places. You can see here, this is at Pine Knoll Shores, and this is about the size of the project that we would propose, and that's what it would kind of end up looking like. So you put these little table-like structures out there, and the material is made out of, I say like burlap dipped in concrete, and they can mold it into any shape that they want, but they found that these table-like structures work the best. So first it looks kind of like a table or PVC or something, but eventually it fills in with oysters because they're just naturally growing on it. And I think a great place for this would be at the Marina Park. So there are plans to put in this new floating dock here. This is the old pier, which is no longer present. But this area would be just to the downstream side of the new floating dock. It'd be a really nice demonstration site where people could see an alternative to hardened bulkheads. And in terms of funding, I think that we could get matching funds from the Coastal Fed. They have state funds available. And we have a new Center for Coastal Sustainability through the Conservancy that could probably provide some funds. And then maybe a small amount of village funds if they wanted to partner on it. But about 185 linear feet long. And I've requested a proposal for that from the company, so I can share that with y'all once we get it. But I just wanted to see if there are any questions about this site or about living shorelines in general. Well, that is all I have. Any other questions?
Any fox,
Any thoughts?
any fox on the island?
Fox, yeah, there are some foxes.
Okay.
Not as many as there used to be, but
Right.
we do see them every so often. Red fox. I have not seen a gray fox ever.
Oh, they're beautiful.
There used to be gray fox.
Yeah,
Have you seen them?
Yeah.
Gray fox? Recently?
Yeah, I've seen them in New Jersey, not here, but I've seen the reds here too. They're so pretty.
Yeah. I think that the coyotes compete with the foxes. I mean, that's been shown other places. So that could be part of what's going on. Also, they do trap foxes on Fort Fisher as well. So I didn't even show this data, but they get some foxes every year.
When living shoreline project, so. Have you looked around at the island, target other locations where this makes a lot of sense?
There is.
Practical point of view as opposed to just educational.
Yeah, so there is one that I'm interested in that I think you're probably aware of, that, or Chris is aware of. There is a home that has a bulkhead. It's right across from the marina, that like Widgeon Court.
Right.
No, not the marina, but Muscadine, so that port area. And that was there was a zoning conversation about that property last year, I think. And I don't know if there are plans for that property now. But the nice thing about that is that it's not buildable. And it's next to this other hardened structure where they seem to be having problems with erosion. I think it could help with that erosion problem and protect some of that marsh. And it's right next to the Kent Mitchell Trail, which is protected area. So that's a possibility. And I showed that to the consultant too, and he thought that would be a possibility there.
Cool.
But it's not very accessible to the public.
Right.
It's okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you.